Today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia Samach Dal, Bava Metzia 64. We're going to start on the bottom of 63b, 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is saying several statements of Rav Nachman, and they connect to interest. There's a question how this statement directly connects to interest. But first, we'll read the statement, then we'll give a theory. Amar Rav Nachman, Haimanda Ozif Pshite Mechavri. So let's say Rav Nachman says there's a person who borrowed money from his friend, Ashkach Bey Tofina, and he found in it more than he borrowed. If it's an amount which we can attribute to a mistake, like a mistake in counting, then he has to return it. But if it's not a mistake in counting, then it's likely that the person is just giving him a gift, and since he's not making a claim for it, you're allowed to keep it. Now, what's the definition of something we could assume that the person made a mistake about? They used to count by fives and tens, so that was the type of mistake, an extra 5 or an extra 10. So Rav Acha Brei Rava says to Rav Ashi, "V'yinish takifahu v'uyav matana." Let's say this is a guy who's typically not associated with giving a gift. He's a strong man, like a tough guy. Doesn't usually go around giving gifts. What will we say there? So he says, "Amarei Dilma Migzal Gazle ve'ivole b'cheshbon." No, it's possible that he stole money and he was too embarrassed to admit that he stole it, so he just added on some extra money in when he paid whatever he owed. Tanya gozo as chavero. As we learned, if somebody steals from his friend, the ivliu will b'cheshbon, and if he robs his friend and he gives extra money when he returns, yatsa, and he's going to be fulfilling his obligation of returning the money. Let's say it's a guy he doesn't have a pre-existing relationship with. He's never done anything with him before. What do we say there? No, still there. Maybe somebody else stole from him. And he said to him, Ki Yazif Poni Pshite Minach Avole B'cheshbon. And he was given this, and maybe somebody else stole the money, and he gave this money to this person. And he says, when this guy's going to come borrow money from you, give him extra. So what does that all have to do with interest? So some of the girsa, that's the opposite. It's that when you come to return the money and he gave him extra, and that would be a concern of interest. So that flips the story. So that's one way to try to understand the connection between this story and the previous stories, or the previous statements. Amar Rav Kahana, Hava Yasivni b'shohi perkei derav. Rav Kahana said, I came in at the end of the shir of Rav. Some say that he didn't come late. Yaakov says it's not that he came late, it's just that that's when they asked the questions. The Shamistika Amar Kari Kari. I heard that Rav said this term, Kari Kari. Kari is like a gourd or a squash. I didn't know what he was talking about. Basar to come Rav, after Rav got up, Amri Lahu, I said to the Bnei Yeshiva, to the other students in the shir, my Kari Kari to come Rav. What's Rav talking about? Amrui, Hachi Kamarav. He says, this is what Rav is saying. This person who gave money to a farmer, to a gardener, a kari, he gave him money for a squash. But Ka'azli Asara Kari B'nei Zaras. And the going price was 10 gourds, Asara Kari B'nei Zarata. So the going price was 10 gourds for the size of a zeres. A zeres is a half an amma for a zuz. So that was the going price. For my zuz, I'll get 10 gourds the size of a zeres. V'amarlei ehivnulach b'nei garmida. And I said to him, I'll give you and I'll give you the zuz now, and the gardener says, I'll give to you for the money that you're going to give me now, I'll pay you later on, not the zeres, but the b'nei garmida, which is double the size. Meaning to say, if you give me the money now, I'm going to give you even more later. Doesn't that, so is that permitted? It's like he's giving, or is that interest? So isnu shari, leisnu aser. So if he actually has the gourds with him at that time, then it's permitted because it's basically just like selling it at a discounted price. But if he doesn't have the gourds with him, then it's prohibited because it's like interest. So Rashi says if he has them but they're small, it's prohibited. So the Gemara says, but isn't this the case pshita? Isn't this obvious? It's obvious. Mao the Tema, the Gemara says, no, you might have said, even the Mela Karabo, since even though they're small now, but they're going to grow on their own, shop your dummy. It will be okay because it's like he has it, since they're going to obviously grow to that size. So we say, no, it's still interest because since right now they're not of a larger size in his field. Kamash Moan. So that's what Rav was saying. So the Gemara wants to know, like, whom is Rav's position? Kaman ki haitana. So Rav's position that he said in his shir is like the following brisa. The Tanya, like we learned in the brisa, haholech lechov es izav, ulzozes rachelav, velurdos es kevarto. Somebody's going to milk his goat or shear his lamb or to get the honey from the beehive. Motzu chaverav, and his friend finds what he's doing. His friend finds him, and he says to him, Mash izi chovos morchorcha. And he says to his friend, whatever I'm going to produce from whatever milk my goat will produce, I'm selling to you for this money. Basically says, you want my milk? I'm going to give it to you for $20. But he doesn't know how much milk the goat's going to produce. So whether it's a lot or a little, I'm selling to you. That's permitted. Why? Why is that permitted? He's getting the money now, and he's only giving him the product later. So it's not necessarily interest because he could produce a lot of milk or a little milk. And this person is accepting upon himself all that, whether there will be gain or loss. And so therefore, even if he'll end up getting the milk at a steep discount, nevertheless, it's not going to be considered a case of what's called agar natar, right? That his money is waiting for him, because if it would be less, he would also have to take it. So there's a lot of risk involved. So therefore, that's going to be permitted. That case is permitted. But if he says to him, but if he says to him, that which the milk that my goat will produce, this and this will be sold to you. In that case, if he says that which this amount of goat which will be produced will be sold to you, and this amount of the lamb will be sold to you, this amount of the honey will be sold to you, that is going to be prohibited, because there he's giving the purchaser a discount, but in exchange for giving him the money in advance. And so therefore he's giving him he's basically saying, I'm selling to you the milk for this amount of money, and it's possibly whatever the goat produces, you're getting the milk at this price, and it's possible that it won't produce that amount of milk, and yet he's giving it to him for that price. So therefore, he's just accepting the possibility of a gain and not the loss. And so therefore, that's going to be considered to be interest. Hold on one second. Basically he's saying, I'm giving to you this amount of milk, and if it's not there, I'm going to make it up to you. And so So that's going to be a case of interest, and that's prohibited. For afagav, the mamela karavu. And we say in this case, even though the milk will be, even though it's a small amount now, it will come on its own. And nevertheless, even the leisnu ba'ishata, since he doesn't have it at that moment, it's going to be prohibited. And so therefore, this is like the case of Rav. And so this seems to be supporting Rav. Ikeda Amri, alternative version, is Amarava, kivin the mamela karavu. Hold on 1 second. Alternative version of this is that Rava said, since that Rava says, "Kivin Melech Rabu Shapir Dummy." Since the case of the going back to the case of the squash, he says that Rav said that since the squash was going to grow on its own, it's going to be permitted, and so therefore, in that case where he says, "I'm going to buy the amount of squash for the higher price," since right now it's small, since it's going to grow on its own, it's going to be permitted. The Gemara says, but how can Rav say that? It's in against this price. That if you say that about the milk that I'm going to give it to you for the cheaper price, it's prohibited. The Gemara says, in the case of the milk, that it's a totally different case, because that milk is not that case of the milk is going to be totally different, because the milk and the wool that will grow after the time of the sale, they're not coming from the milk and the wool that was there at the time of the sale, because the shakule lahai, that let's say you would remove this milk, it will become a different milk in its place. And so therefore it's not all connected to the milk that was there at the time of the sale. But hacha minei karabu, but this squash is growing from the small squash, because the kishaku elahai, if you get rid of the small squash, meaning to say, if you get rid of the vegetable that's there, the squash, nothing will grow. But if you get rid of the milk that's there in this place, then a new milk will come in its place. So therefore, by the milk, it's going to be prohibited, because it's not at all connected. But the squash, to do it like that with the squash, to do this type of transaction will be permitted, because it's obviously the same squash. And Amar Abaye says, Shari Leila Inish Lamemer Leila Chavre, a person is permitted to say to his friend, Helach Arba Zuze Achavisa Dechamra. So a person is allowed to say to his friend, take this 4 zuz for this barrel of wine, itakfa b'rshusech, and he's allowed to say to him, if it will turn into vinegar, b'rshusech, that's your loss. Iyakara, if it goes up in value, or izila b'rshusech, if it goes up or down in value, I get the benefits and the loss. But if it turns into vinegar, that's all on you. Meaning to say, I'm willing to absorb some loss, but not a total loss. So Amar Rav Sharvayo Abaye. So, but why? So it says Rav Sharvayo to Abaye, I'm talking about why is that permitted? High carbo schar or rachel kohav said who? Isn't this the case where you go into a transaction and you say, I'll get the reward, but I won't get the loss? And that we said is prohibited. So you say, no, I'm away. Keeping the mikabole zula carbo zehu. No, since he's accepting upon himself some loss, just not a total loss, then since he's open to both a loss and a gain, then we're going to say, therefore, it's permitted. As long as it's open to some loss, even though not a total loss, we're going to say it's permitted. So now we say, a malves chavero, that somebody who, the next Mishnah states, a malves chavero, well, yodor bechatzero chinam, somebody who lends money to his friend is not allowed to live in his courtyard for nothing. Meaning to say, Reuben lends money to Shimon, and Shimon has a courtyard. Reuben can't just camp out in Shimon's courtyard for free. And he can't even get a discount on the courtyard that he's living in. That's a form of interest. Interest is not just paying somebody extra money, it's also giving him a gift or giving him a favor. And so therefore, if Reuben lends money to Shimon, he can't benefit from Shimon's courtyard. Amar Rav Yosef Bar Menyumi, Amar Rav Nachman, Afa Pisha Amru. So now we go back to Baba Kama. So yeah, even though we said Adar b'chatzer chaver shlomi daito eno tzarach aloso star, even though we say if somebody lives in his friend's courtyard, without his knowledge, you don't have to pay him for it because this is a courtyard that he wouldn't have rented out anyway, and you wouldn't have paid for it, and you wouldn't have rented out a courtyard either. So it's zen and v'zelo chaser. This one is benefiting, but the other one's not losing anything because you're benefiting by staying in the courtyard, but he wouldn't have rented it out, so he's not losing anything. So even though we say that if you dwell in somebody's courtyard without his knowledge and he wouldn't have rented it out, you don't need to pay him under those circumstances. However, but let's say, however, even though that's typically the case, let's say somebody lent him money, and then you go and live in his courtyard, then you do have to pay him. My kamashmoan, what's it teaching us? Why would you have to pay him if he had, under these circumstances, if you had lent him money and now you're dwelling in his courtyard, then you do need to pay him because then it could look like interest. So Gemara says, why do we even need to tell us this? Tanina, isn't this exactly what our Mishnah is saying? What's Rav Yosef Bar Menyumi have to tell us this? Isn't our Mishnah say that if somebody lends you money, you're not allowed to live in his courtyard? If somebody lends money to his friend, can't live in his friend's courtyard. Well, the Gemara says, no, if it was just from our Mishnah, I would have said, if it was just from our Mishnah, I might have said that's only you can only not allow to stay there if it was a courtyard that was typically rented out, and a man who typically rents out courtyards. But if it's a courtyard that's typically not rented, the gaver do avidu, and a person typically doesn't rent, I might have said, well, then you're not actually benefiting. I might have said it's not prohibited. Kamashwan, no, it's prohibited in the case of interest because it looks like interest. The alternative version of this is Ikadamri. The alternative version of this story is that says Rav Nachman, that the alternative version is that Rav Yosef Bar Menyumi says in the name of Rav Nachman that even though somebody who lives in his friend's courtyard, that his knowledge does not need to pay for it. But if he says Hilveni, let me borrow money, vidar b'chatzeri, and then I'm also going to let you live in my courtyard. Then you do have to pay him. Why? Because then it's explicit. Manda Amar Alveo, the one who says, one who says he just lent it without specifying it being explicit. Kol shekain Alveni. For sure, if he says, let me money and then I'll let you stay in my courtyard, for sure it's prohibited. Manda Amar Alveni, but the one who says, let me money and I'll let you stay in my courtyard, of Alveo. Well, but if he just borrowed money without specifying it, then it wouldn't be prohibited. My timer, since it wasn't the original intent of the loan to say, let me borrow money and I'll let you stay in my courtyard, so therefore there's no problem with it. So since that wasn't the original intent, we're not going to say it's prohibited. Rav Yosef Bar Chama takif avdei de inche. So Rav Yosef Bar Chama grabbed a hold of a slave and used the slave of a man who he had lent money to. He worked a slave. So basically it's like a form of interest because this guy owes him $100 and he still owes him $100. In the meantime, he used a slave, so he got value. So Rava Bere. So Rava says to his father, my time Avin Marachi, why have you done this? Isn't that interest? I'm like on a Rav Nachman sphere, and he says no, because I hold like Rav Nachman. It says that Rav Nachman Abda Nahom Kreise Lo Shavi. Your slave, you're not getting any benefit from because you have to feed the slave, and he doesn't even work for the bread in his belly. Meaning to say, I'm actually losing money. I'm like Amar Damar Rav Nachman Kadon Dari Avde Demereke Bekube. Yeah, he says maybe there's certain types of slaves that they're not worth the food you have to feed them. Like Dari, all he does is dance all day in the bars. But Avdi Achrine, but Miyamar, but does he say this by other slaves? So this guy's really working for you. He says, I hold like Rav Katina in the name of Rav. And if you take a hold of your friend's slave and you work him, you don't have to pay. Because the owner doesn't want his slave just sitting around not doing any work because he doesn't want him to get used to being lazy. And so therefore, I did him a favor. Yeah, sure, you could make that claim where you didn't actually lend him money. But Mark, even the Masik Buluzuze, but since you lent him money, Milchse karibis. Now it looks like interest. Amar Rav Yosef Bar Miyumi, Amar Rav Nachman, Afu Pisha, Amar Adar B'chatz HaChaver Shlomi Daito, Eno Tzarech Avoso Schar. Even though we generally state that somebody who lives in his friend's courtyard without his knowledge doesn't need to pay him. Halveo V'dar B'chatzero. But if you lend him money and you live in his courtyard, Tzarech Avoso Schar, then you do need to pay him. So, yeah, you could only do that. You could only do that in a case where he doesn't actually owe you money. But if he owes you money, it looks like interest. So when his son told this to him, he said, I'm not going to do it anymore. Because you know what? You're actually correct. So I don't have to return the money because it's just milsei karibis. But Rav Yosef Bar Minyumi, Rav Yosef Bar Chama said to his son, you know what? You're correct. I'm not going to do this anymore. Right? We can still go on, but let's just stop the recording. It's the end of the daf.